Yeah. Welcome back to the channel, and this video is going to be a continuation of endocrine systems and homeostasis, right? Now, today we focus on the pancreas, right? Now, with respect to endocrine systems and homeostasis, we're going to say that the pancreas functions to regulate blood glucose concentration. Now, this simply means that the pancreas is responsible for controlling the amount of glucose that is present in the blood, right? Now, exactly how does the pancreas regulate the amount of glucose that is present in the blood? Well, it does this by secreting a hormone. Remember, we said that hormones are chemical messengers and they're usually protein in nature, right? So a hormone is going to be secreted by an endocrine gland. And then when it is secreted by an endocrine gland, it is going to travel by means of the bloodstream because it is secreted directly into the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, it is going to reach our target organ, right? So when we talk about the pancreas, this is our pancreas here. It is going to secrete a hormone. Now this hormone is secreted directly into the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, it is going to reach our target organ, right? So it means that the target organ for the hormones that are secreted by the pancreas is the liver. It is not only the liver, it also includes the muscles, right? So the pancreas will secrete hormones, which is insulin as well as glucagon. When insulin and glucagon are secreted, they're secreted directly into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream, they're going to be transported to the target organ, which is the liver and the muscles, from where they're going to regulate the amount of glucose that is present in the blood, right? Now, before we go into more details in that respect, it is worth noting again that the pancreas is the only gland that is considered to be both endocrine as well as exocrine, right? How is this the case? Well, we consider it to be an endocrine gland simply because it secretes a hormone. Now, any gland that secretes a hormone is considered to be an endocrine gland, right? So hormones are secreted directly into the bloodstream. But the pancreas also secretes something that is called pancreatic juice, right? Pancreatic juice. Now, this pancreatic juice, it is secreted into ducts. So it is transported by means of ducts. Now, because this pancreatic juice is not a hormone and it is also transported by means of ducts. Now, these are characteristics of an exocrine gland. So the pancreas is both endocrine as well as exocrine. It is endocrine because it secretes hormones, and it is exocrine because it also secretes pancreatic juice, which is transported by means of ducts. Right. Now, let's say we're talking about the pancreas, right? We said that the pancreas is an endocrine gland in the sense that it secretes a hormone. Now, the hormones that are secreted by the pancreas is the hormone insulin as well as the hormone glucagon, right? Now, insulin and glucagon, they've got opposite functions, right? Now, the function of the hormone insulin, the function of insulin is simply to lower blood glucose concentration. So when insulin is secreted, it is secreted when the concentration of glucose is high. Why is insulin secreted when the concentration of glucose is high? Because the function of insulin is to lower blood glucose concentration. So whenever the concentration of glucose is high, the pancreas is going to respond by secreting the hormone insulin, which functions to lower blood glucose concentration. But the opposite is true for the hormone glucagon. The function of glucagon is to increase blood glucose concentration. So when the hormone glucagon is secreted by the pancreas, it is secreted when the concentration of glucose is low, so that it can increase the concentration of glucose, right? So that is why we say that insulin and glucagon, they function antagonistically, they function opposite to each other. Insulin lowers the blood glucose concentration and glucagon increases the blood glucose concentration, right? Now, let's look at how the hormone insulin functions to lower this blood glucose concentration. Well, it does this in two ways. Way number one, it is said that insulin simply stimulates the conversion of excess glucose into glycogen. And then when this excess glucose has been converted to glycogen, it is going to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles. That is way number one. So when the concentration of glucose is in excess, when it is too much, the pancreas will secrete the hormone insulin. Now, insulin will stimulate the conversion. What is to convert? To convert is simply to change from one form to another, right? So when we have this excess glucose, it is going to be converted from being glucose to being something that is called glycogen, right? When this glucose has been converted, has been changed into glycogen, it is then that this glycogen is going to be stored in the liver and the muscles. So this action of converting excess glucose into glycogen, it lowers the blood glucose concentration because the glucose has been converted to glycogen and stored in the liver. And as a consequence, the concentration of glucose that is in the bloodstream, it's simply going to decrease, right? So that is way number one. Way number two, it is said that insulin stimulates the absorption of glucose into the cells for use during cellular respiration, right? So when again the concentration of glucose is high, insulin will stimulate this excess glucose to be taken into the cells. And when this glucose is taken into the cells, it is going to be used during the process of cellular respiration, right? What is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration simply refers to the process whereby glucose is broken down to release energy in the form of ATP, right? Now, because we've got a large concentration of glucose and we need to lower that glucose concentration, by taking the glucose out of the bloodstream and then absorbing it into the cells and making sure that that glucose is used during cellular respiration. Because some glucose is used, it only makes sense that the concentration of glucose in the blood has to become lower simply because some of the glucose has been used, right? So these are the two ways that insulin functions to decrease blood glucose level. One more time. We said that it stimulates the conversion of excess glucose into glycogen. When this excess glucose has been converted to glycogen, it is going to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles. Again, what does to convert mean? To convert simply means to change from one form to another. So we're going to have glucose and we're going to change it into glycogen. What is glycogen? That is the stored form of glucose in animals, right? So we're going to store this glucose and we store it as glycogen. And by storing it as glycogen, we lower the concentration of glucose that is present in the blood. Number two, we said that it stimulates the absorption of glucose into the cells. When this glucose has been absorbed into the cells, what is it going to do in the cells? It is going to be used during cellular respiration. So it is going to be broken down in order to release energy in the form of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, right? Now, what if glucagon is secreted by the pancreas? Well, when glucagon is secreted, we know that the function of glucagon is simply to increase blood glucose concentration, right? Now, exactly how does glucagon function to increase blood glucose concentration? It does this by stimulating the conversion of the stored glycogen back into glucose. And after we've converted this glycogen back into glucose, we are going to release this glucose back into the bloodstream, right? Now, remember, we said that with insulin, it is going to convert the glucose into glycogen. And we said that glycogen is the stored form of glucose in animals, right? So it is there in the liver and the muscles. So when we've got a shortage of glucose in the blood, then the pancreas will secrete this hormone, glucagon. And when glucagon is secreted, it is going to go into that glucose that is stored in the liver and muscles as glycogen. And it is going to convert that glycogen back into glucose. And when that glycogen has been converted back into glucose, the glucose is going to be released back into the bloodstream. And by releasing this glucose back into the bloodstream, then the concentration of glucose that is in the blood is going to increase. So that is how insulin and glucagon function to regulate the amount of glucose that is available in the blood, right? So now let's try to explain those as process. Let's say we've got a situation where the concentration of glucose is too high. We know that if the concentration of glucose is too high, the body will want to lower the blood glucose concentration back to normal. And there's only one hormone that functions to lower blood glucose concentration, and that is the hormone insulin. So because we know here that this scenario calls for a case where the concentration of glucose is high, we're going to say that the islets of Langerhans, which are found in the pancreas, are going to be stimulated. The islets of Langerhans are a patch of cells that are found in the pancreas. They are the actual cells that are going to secrete the hormones insulin and glucagon, right? So the islets of Langerhans that are in the pancreas are going to be stimulated, right? When they are stimulated, they are going to secrete the hormone insulin. Now, one might question, why is it that we say that the pancreas secretes the hormones insulin and glucagon? Well, the actual cells, which are the islets of Langerhans, which secrete these hormones, they are found within or inside of the pancreas, right? So it makes sense to say that the pancreas secretes the hormone insulin as well as glucagon, because the actual cells that are responsible for secreting these hormones are found within the pancreas. So we can generalize, right? So again, when the blood glucose concentration is high, we're going to say that the islets of Langerhans that are found in the pancreas are going to be stimulated. When they're stimulated, they're going to secrete the hormone insulin into the bloodstream, right? And we know that the function of insulin is simply to lower blood glucose level. And we've already said that it lowers blood glucose concentration in two ways, right? Number one, it is said that it is going to stimulate the absorption of glucose into the cells. Again, when the glucose is absorbed into the cells, it is going to be used during cellular respiration. That was way number two in the previous slide. Here we put it as way number one. They're interchangeable, right? Number two, we're going to say that it is going to stimulate the liver and the muscle to convert the excess glucose back into glycogen. Again, we said that glycogen, this is the stored form of glucose in animals, right? So when the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas secrete the hormone insulin, they're going to lower blood glucose concentration. How do they do that? They're going to convert the excess glucose into glycogen, and they're also going to stimulate the absorption of this glucose into the cells. So these 2 points, they're interchangeable. You can start with whichever one you like. It's fine, right? And then now, when we convert the excess glucose into glycogen, then this glycogen is going to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles, right? So by storing the glucose in the liver as well as in the muscle, we're going to lower the blood glucose concentration. We're going to decrease the amount of glucose that is currently present within the blood, simply because we've changed some of that glucose and we've stored it as glycogen. So we've reduced the amount of glucose that is in the blood. The same applies when we stimulate the absorption of glucose into the cells. So we're going to remove some of the glucose that was in the blood and put it into the cells, where it is going to be used during cellular respiration. And also, by so doing, we decrease the concentration of glucose that was in the blood. And as a consequence, the concentration of glucose is going to decrease back to normal, right? Now, what if we've got a situation where the concentration of glucose is low? Well, we know that there's only one hormone that is responsible for increasing blood glucose concentration. It is the hormone glucagon, right? Now, we're going to say that the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas are going to be stimulated, right? When they're stimulated, they're going to secrete the hormone glucagon, and we know that glucagon functions to increase blood glucose concentration. We've already said that the way that glucagon functions to increase blood glucose concentration, it is simply because it converts the stored glycogen back into glucose. And when that stored glycogen is converted back into glucose, it is going to be released back into the bloodstream. And when we release this glucose into the bloodstream, then we're going to increase the concentration of glucose that is in the blood, because we are adding glucose into the blood. We initially had glycogen, we changed the glycogen back into glucose, and when we change the glycogen back into glucose, we simply take the glucose and return it back into the blood. And by so doing, the concentration of glucose that is in the bloodstream is going to increase back to what? Back to normal. Right. Now, let's talk about a disease which is called diabetes mellitus, right? Now, diabetes mellitus is said to be caused by an inability to lower blood glucose concentration. Now, when we say that a person has got an inability to lower their blood glucose concentration, it tells us that this person's blood glucose concentration remains abnormally high, So they are unable to lower that blood glucose concentration. As a matter of fact, an abnormally high glucose concentration is one of the symptoms for diabetes mellitus, alongside the excretion of glucose in urine. Urine is not supposed to have glucose in it. If it has glucose, it can be a sign of diabetes mellitus, alongside with fatigue, increased thirst, amongst other things. So the symptoms of diabetes mellitus, they're not limited to these four. There are many, but I've only mentioned these four, right? Now, what causes this diabetes mellitus? What causes an inability of the body to lower the blood glucose concentration back to normal? Well, it may be due to the production of an insufficient amount of insulin, right? So in order to lower blood glucose concentration back to normal, you need a certain amount of insulin, right? But if you are going to produce a very low concentration of insulin in order for it to lower a very large concentration of glucose in the bloodstream, then the very low concentration of insulin is going to be unable to lower the larger concentration of glucose back to normal. And also, as a consequence, it tells me that the concentration of glucose will remain high because the secretion of insulin is insufficient. You needed more insulin in order to lower the blood glucose back to normal. So if you secrete less insulin, then the blood glucose concentration will simply remain abnormally high because the insulin is in shortage. It is insufficient, right? Number two, it is caused by the production of a poor quality insulin. So you may produce a sufficient amount of insulin, but if the quality of the insulin produced is poor, then it is also going to be unable to lower the blood glucose concentration back to normal. And therefore, as a result of these two factors, the concentration of insulin will simply, the concentration of glucose rather, will simply remain abnormally high. And when it remains abnormally high, it results in this disease that we call diabetes mellitus, right? Now, with what we've learned in mind, let's try to look and analyze the diagram that we've been given. Now, at this top box, it shows us the glucose level, that is the glucose concentration in the blood, right? In this left hand side, it says that the concentration of glucose is too high, and then in this right hand side, it says that the concentration of glucose is too low. Let's start with this right hand side, right? So here we're talking about the concentration of glucose that is too low, right? And here it says that detection by an endocrine gland. Now, what is this endocrine gland detecting? It is detecting a low concentration of glucose, right? We only have one endocrine gland that is concerned with regulating the amount of glucose that is in the blood. Whether the glucose is low or high, we only have one endocrine gland that is responsible for regulating the concentration of glucose, right? So the endocrine gland that is going to detect that the concentration of glucose is too low, it can only be the pancreas, right? So that endocrine gland has to be the pancreas. Now, we look at the response once this endocrine gland has detected that the concentration of glucose is too low. It is said that it is going to respond by secreting hormone 2. Now, we can reason that since the concentration of glucose here is too low, then there's only one hormone that is going to be secreted by the pancreas, which is responsible for increasing the concentration of glucose back to normal. Because remember, here the concentration of glucose being too low is a problem. We need to increase the concentration of glucose back to normal. We cannot have the concentration of glucose to be too low or too high. We need it to be normal. So when it is too low, we must increase it. How do we increase it? By secreting a hormone from the pancreas. And what hormone is responsible for increasing the blood glucose concentration back to normal? Well, it can only be the hormone glucagon. It can only be the hormone glucagon. So once the pancreas has secreted glucagon in order to increase this low glucose concentration, what is going to be the response? Well, the response is going to be simply that the blood glucose concentration increases back to normal, right? So blood glucose concentration increases. increases back to normal, right? It increases back to normal. Now let's look at the other side. At this left hand side, we said that the concentration of glucose here is too high. Now again, we're going to go to detection by an endocrine gland. What is this endocrine gland detecting now? It is detecting that the concentration of glucose is too high. So that is a problem. We need the concentration of glucose to be within normal limits. We need to lower it back to normal, right? So what hormone is secreted by an endocrine gland in order to lower blood glucose concentration? We only have one hormone that is secreted by which endocrine gland? The pancreas. So the endocrine gland affected here is also the pancreas, right? So how is it going to respond here? It is going to respond by secreting hormone 1. What is hormone 1 supposed to accomplish? It is supposed to lower the blood glucose concentration that is said to be too high. So it is going to lower this blood concentration by secreting the hormone what? By secreting the hormone insulin, right? So once insulin has been secreted, what is going to be the response? What is going to happen? Well, we know that the function of insulin is simply to lower blood glucose concentration. So by secreting insulin, then the blood glucose concentration, concentration decreases back to normal. We're going to decrease it back to normal. That is a quick interpretation of this diagram, right? It is very simple. Now let's continue with glucose, right? Now we've got some scenarios or questions rather, right, to look at. Point number 1, we're going to look at why people that have got diabetes mellitus are going to have very little glycogen that is stored in their liver as well as in their muscles, right? So take this to be a fact that people that are suffering from diabetes mellitus, they're going to have a very low or very little glycogen that is stored in their liver and also in their muscles. Why does this make sense? Well, in order for glycogen to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles, it must be under the influence of the hormone insulin, right? Because remember, we said that the function of insulin is to lower blood glucose concentration. It lowers blood glucose concentration by stimulating the conversion of excess glucose into glycogen. And then this glycogen is going to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles. But if this person is said to be suffering from diabetes mellitus, then we've got two problems. Then this person must secrete very little insulin, or the quality of the insulin that this person secretes is not good enough. It is of a poor quality, right? So if an insufficient amount of insulin is produced, then there's going to be very little glucose that is going to be converted into glycogen. And consequently, very little glucose, or very little glycogen rather, is going to be stored in the liver and the muscles. Let me repeat that one more time, right? We're looking at why a person with diabetes mellitus will have very little glycogen in their liver and the muscles. Now, in order for us to have the glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose, it is under the influence of the hormone insulin. Why is this the case? Because insulin functions to lower blood glucose concentration. How does it do this? It does this by stimulating the conversion of excess glucose into glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose in animals, right? Now, once this glucose has been converted into glycogen, it is then that it is going to be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles, right? But if a person is suffering from diabetes mellitus, this person secretes very, very, very low amounts of insulin, and also the insulin that they produce is not of a good quality. Now, what is the consequence of this? If an insufficient, that is to say, if very little insulin is going to be secreted, then very little glucose is going to be converted into glycogen. Consequently, very little glycogen is going to be stored in the muscles and the cells, simply because there is not enough. There is a little amount of glycogen that is going to be available, caused by very little amount of insulin being present. Consequently, this person will have very little glycogen stored in their liver as well as in their muscles, right? Let's look at point number 2. Point number 2, we'll look at why people with diabetes mellitus are advised to have fewer smaller meals than have fewer larger meals. They're supposed to have many smaller meals, right, and fewer larger meals. So change this fewer into many, right? So let's say you've got diabetes mellitus. The advice is that when you eat, you are not supposed to have one large meal. You are supposed to have many smaller meals that are spaced out throughout the day, right? So you are not supposed to have one large meal and be overly full, just fewer meals. Now, why is this the case? Now, when you eat, the concentration of glucose is going to increase, right? So if you eat very little food, if you eat smaller meals, then the concentration of glucose is going to increase only slightly. This is because you have eaten smaller meals. But if you eat a large meal, the concentration of glucose is going to increase a lot exponentially, right? There's going to be a large increase in the concentration of glucose because you have eaten a larger meal. But if you eat a smaller meal, then the concentration of glucose is going to increase, yes, but it is going to increase by a small amount. If you eat a large meal, it is going to increase by a large amount, right? Now, let's look at why it is important, why it is advised to eat smaller meals, right? When you've got diabetes mellitus, you are going to secrete an insufficient amount of insulin. You are going to secrete an insulin that is not of a good quality, right? So you do not produce sufficient insulin. So if you do not produce sufficient insulin, then therefore the insulin that you produce is very small. And if you eat food and the glucose concentration only increases slightly, then this insufficient amount of insulin that you produce may be sufficient to lower the glucose concentration back to normal because it did not rise by such a big amount. It only rose a little. So a little insulin may be sufficient in order to lower the blood glucose concentration back to normal, right? But if you eat a larger meal, like a larger meal will result in more glucose, right? So the concentration of glucose will increase exponentially when you had a large meal. But this is a problem because if it increases too much, the concentration of glucose increases too much and you produce very little insulin, then the insufficient amount of insulin that you produce will be unable to lower the blood glucose concentration back to normal. And as a consequence, the blood glucose concentration will remain high and it will not be lowered because the amount of insulin that you produce will be insufficient in order to lower that amount of glucose back to normal. Consequently, it remains high, right? I hope that makes sense, right? In the sense that more insulin will be needed to lower this more glucose back to normal, right? Now, let's look at the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, they're found in the kidneys. And when you talk about the adrenal glands, we have to focus on two hormones. We have to focus on the hormone adrenaline and also on the hormone aldosterone, right? Adrenaline, this is our flight or fight hormones. It is secreted during emergencies. And then we've got the hormone aldosterone, which functions to regulate the blood sodium concentration. It also plays a role in the regulation of water within our bodies, osmoregulation, right? Now, let's talk about the kidney. Now, the kidney is said to secrete the hormone adrenaline and also the hormone aldosterone. These are both hormones that are secreted by the adrenal glands, right? But let's look at the target organ for the hormone adrenaline. It is said to target the heart, the liver, the brain, the blood vessels, as well as the eyes. So there's a plethora. There are many organs that are targeted by the hormone adrenaline. But when we talk about the hormone aldosterone here, we're only going to target the kidneys, right? Now, what is the function of this hormone that we call adrenaline? It functions to help the body to meet emergencies. This is a response that we call the flight or fight response. When under the influence of adrenaline, you can choose to flight, which is to run away, or you can choose to fight. This is when you are in danger, right? And then when we talk about aldosterone, we already said that it functions to regulate blood sodium concentration and also functions to regulate the concentration of water alongside the hormone ADH. Right. Here we're looking at the effect of adrenaline, right? We can see this young gentleman here being chased by a dog. Obviously, he chose the flight option. He chose to run away. Someone may choose to stand and fight the dog, right? Pick up stones, try to kick the dog. That will be the fight response. This young man chose the flight response, right? He is being influenced by the hormone adrenaline. Now let's try to look at how adrenaline works, right? Number one, we said that it increases the rate and depth of breathing to obtain more oxygen. So when under the influence of this hormone adrenaline, you are going to be scared. You're going to be fighting for your life, right? How does adrenaline help you to survive in this case? So it is going to increase the rate and depth of breathing so that more oxygen is obtained more quickly. Here you are going to be breathing very fast. And the reason why you breathe very fast is so that you obtain more oxygen. Why is it necessary for you to obtain more oxygen? So that this oxygen can be used during aerobic respiration in order to break down glucose to release energy. So oxygen will be necessary. All right? Number two, it is said that adrenaline stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose, and then this glucose is going to be released back into the bloodstream. Now, this statement sounds very familiar, right? We also said the same thing about the hormone glucagon, which is secreted by the pancreas. So it tells us that adrenaline and the hormone glucagon have got a shared function in that they are both capable of increasing the blood glucose concentration by converting the stored glycogen back into glucose, which is going to be then released into the bloodstream, right? So if we are talking about multiple choice and they're going to say increases blood glucose concentration and they give us two options, glucagon and adrenaline, our answer there has to be both A and B, because adrenaline is also capable of increasing the blood glucose concentration. Now, why is it necessary for blood glucose concentration to increase during emergencies? Well, so that more glucose is available to be broken down into energy, right? So that you can have more energy in order to fight or to flight. Number three, it is said that it increases the metabolic rate to increase energy availability for muscular activity. Well, what is metabolism, right? The word metabolic comes from the word metabolism, right? Metabolism simply refers to all chemical processes that occurs within a cell. Now, there's a very particular process that we call cellular respiration, which is a metabolic process, right? It is a metabolic process because it occurs within a cell. Now, cellular respiration results in the breaking down of glucose into energy, right? So if we increase the metabolic rate, this means that we increase the rate of cellular respiration. And by increasing the rate of cellular respiration, we also increase the rate at which glucose is broken down in order to release energy. So more energy becomes available for muscular activity. Again, this will be your fight or your flight response, right? So if we look at these first three functions, they all have to do with glucose in one way or another, right? Increasing the rate and depth of breathing to obtain more oxygen. Why is more oxygen necessary? In order to be used during aerobic respiration, right? That is cellular respiration that occurs in the presence of oxygen to break down the glucose into energy, right? And then number two, by stimulating stored glycogen into glucose, then more glucose become available to be broken down into energy, which allows you to fight or to flight. And then number three, by increasing the metabolic rate, we also said that cellular respiration is a metabolic process. So when we increase the rate of cellular respiration, then more glucose is going to be broken down at a faster rate in order to release energy, in order for you to fight or to run away, which is our flight response, right? Number four, it is said that it dilates the blood vessels of the heart, the brain, as well as the skeletal muscles in order for more blood to be able to flow to these three parts. So during a fight or a flight response, when adrenaline is secreted, more blood must flow to the heart, to the brain, and to the skeletal muscle. right? When more blood flows to the heart is going to be able to beat and then send that blood to these parts, to the brain and the skeletal muscles. Why do we need more blood in the brain? For clarity of thought. Why do we need more blood in the skeletal muscles? To provide oxygen and glucose, which is going to be used during cellular respiration, right? By the word dilate, we simply mean they become bigger. This is vasodilation. We're going to make the blood capillaries, the blood vessels, to become thicker so that more blood can flow in these blood vessels, right? To the brain, the skeletal muscles, and the heart. It will be needed. Number 5, we said that it constricts the blood vessels of the digestive system and the skin, so less blood flows to these parts. So during this flight or fight response, we do not need the digestive system, right? And also the skin. What we need is to be able to run away or to fight, right? So we restrict or we limit the amount of blood that flows to these parts so that we can prioritize more blood going to the heart, the brain, and the skeletal muscles in order to fight or to flight. And then number 6, it causes the pupils to dilate, allowing more light to enter the eye for clear vision. You need to be able to see very clearly during this response, right? And adrenaline helps by making the pupil in the eye to dilate. Of course, this is the pupillary mechanism, right? It is similar to pupillary mechanism in dim light. So that is where the pupil are going to dilate, which simply means they become bigger. And when they're bigger, more light is going to be able to enter into the eye. And when more light is able to enter into the eye, then vision is going to become clearer. Right. Let's talk about the hormone aldosterone. Right. I'm going to try to explain using this diagram, and then hopefully everything that I'm explaining is in this next slide. Right. What we have here is the structure of the nephron, right? We know that the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. We find the nephron inside of the kidneys, right? We've got about 1 million nephrons in each kidney, right? So we said that the function of aldosterone is that it regulates the sodium content within the body. Here specifically, we're going to focus on how aldosterone is going to affect the reabsorption of sodium when we've got a higher concentration of sodium and when we've got a lower concentration of sodium within the bloodstream, right? Now, it is important to note that this sodium is going to be reabsorbed in this part. This is what we call the ascending limb. This is the ascending limb. It is part of what we call the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle, right? It is also going to be reabsorbed at part C, which is our distal convoluted tubule. And then finally, it is going to be reabsorbed at the collecting tubule. Right. Let's talk about the reabsorption of sodium in this ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Let me change color. Right? Now, in this ascending limb of the loop of Henle, we're going to have sodium be reabsorbed. Right? When sodium is being reabsorbed, it is going to be reabsorbed from this ascending loop of Henle into a part of the kidney that we simply call the renal medulla. Right? Into this part that we call the renal medulla. Now, in the renal medulla, there is a very high concentration of sodium. There is a very high concentration of salt, right? And because it has got a high concentration of salt, we say it is hypertonic. When we say it is hypertonic, we're going to say it has a higher concentration of salt with very little water, right? So there's more salt than water, and therefore it is hypertonic. This is the renal medulla, right? So sodium is going to be reabsorbed from the ascending limb of the loop of Henle into this renal medulla, right? But if we're saying that the renal medulla has got a very high concentration of sodium, and then this tells us that inside of this ascending limb there's going to be a lower concentration of sodium than in the renal medulla, more or less, right? Then this sodium is going to be reabsorbed against the concentration gradient because it will be moving from an area of lower concentration to an area where it is in very high concentration. And in order for this to happen, then this reabsorption must be active. What do we mean when we say this absorption must be active? We're saying that it will require energy. Now, the process here that happens in order to reabsorb the sodium into renal medulla and then consequently into the blood capillaries, we call it the sodium. This is the actual process. We call it the sodium potassium pump. We call it the sodium potassium pump. Right? Now, this is the actual process through which sodium is reabsorbed from the ascending limb of the loop of Henle into the renal medulla, and once it is in the renal medulla, it is going to be reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. Right? Now, the sodium potassium pump is an active process. What do we mean when we say it is an active process? It is an active process simply because it requires energy. Why does it require energy? Because sodium is being reabsorbed against the concentration gradient. It is moving from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration, right? So this sodium will move from here to there, right? So it is going to require energy, right? And then we come to the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule, right? Let's talk about a scenario where the concentration of sodium is high, where we've got a very high concentration of sodium, right? So if the concentration of sodium is high, this is what is going to happen. The kidneys are going to secrete less of the hormone aldosterone. Why are they going to secrete less of the hormone aldosterone? Well, this is simply because more aldosterone simply result in more sodium being reabsorbed, and less aldosterone result in less aldosterone being reabsorbed, right? Now, because the concentration of sodium here, we're saying that it is going to be more, then as a consequence, there's going to be less aldosterone that is going to be what? That is going to be secreted. Now, when we secrete less aldosterone, then the walls of the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the walls of the collecting tubules, are going to become less permeable to sodium. When we say they're less permeable, we're saying that they are not going to allow sodium to pass through freely. Very little sodium will be able to pass through if it is able to pass through, right? Because if more sodium was able to pass through, it was going to be reabsorbed by the blood capillaries. But we do not want to reabsorb more sodium, because here we're talking about a scenario where the concentration of sodium is already high in the blood. So we want to lower it. So we lower it by making the walls of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule to be less permeable to sodium. So less sodium is unable to leave the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule and be absorbed by the blood capillaries. So more sodium remains within these tubules, right? So if more sodium remains within these tubules, it is going to be excreted from the body as urine. So your urine is going to have more sodium. So by excreting urine with more sodium, then the concentration of sodium in the blood is able to lower back to normal. But what if the concentration of sodium in the blood was too low? Well, the opposite was going to happen. The amount of aldosterone that was going to be secreted was going to be high. We're going to secrete a high or a large amount of aldosterone. What was a large amount of aldosterone going to do? A large amount of aldosterone will simply make the walls of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule to become more permeable to sodium. When they're more permeable to sodium, it means that more sodium is going to be able to pass through this distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule, right? And when more sodium is able to pass through, then more sodium is going to be reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. And when more sodium is reabsorbed into the blood capillaries, then the concentration of sodium is simply going to increase back to normal. This is simply because there's going to be a lower concentration of sodium in the urine that is going to be produced, and therefore very little sodium is going to be excreted from the body. So more sodium is retained and less sodium is excreted, and as a consequence, the concentration of sodium within the body is going to increase back to normal, right? So this is under the influence of aldosterone. Again, here the absorption of sodium is going to be active simply because it requires what? It requires oxygen. It is going to be reabsorbed from the ascending limb of the loop of Henle and then into the renal medulla. This is an active process, and this active process, we call it the sodium potassium pump, right? And we said that this is when sodium is being reabsorbed against the concentration gradient. This is the opposite of diffusion. Remember, diffusion, that is the movement of particles from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. But here sodium moves in the opposite direction. It moves from a lower concentration to a higher concentration. This is against the concentration gradient, and therefore this process has to be active. It must require energy, right? So here in West, this is simply what I was describing in the previous slide. Here we're going to talk about when blood glucose concentration is high. When it is high, less aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal glands, and because we've secreted less aldosterone, then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule will become less permeable to sodium. What does less permeable mean? It means that they are going to allow very little sodium to pass through and be reabsorbed, right? Because less sodium is able to pass through, then more sodium remains in the bloodstream, and as a consequence, less sodium is reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. So more sodium remains into the blood, more sodium remains in the renal tubules, and therefore more sodium is also going to be excreted in urine, and as a consequence, the concentration of sodium in the blood is going to decrease back to normal. But when we have the blood sodium concentration being low, then more aldosterone is necessary. When more aldosterone is secreted, then the distal convoluted tubule and collecting tubule become more permeable to sodium. When they're more permeable, then more sodium is able to pass from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule. Therefore, more sodium is going to be reabsorbed. If more sodium is reabsorbed, then less sodium remains in the renal tubules, and therefore less sodium is going to be excreted as part of urine. And since we secrete less and retain more sodium, then the concentration of sodium in the blood will increase back to normal, right? Until next time, if you like the video, please consider liking and also subscribing to the channel. Bye bye.